I never imagined that a stranger would walk into my life on Christmas Eve carrying the name of my daughter like a candle in the dark. I never imagined anyone would dare speak that name again, not in this town, not in this freezing silence where people pretend tragedies melt with the snow. My girl was gone, and with her went every light I had ever trusted. I thought the world had accepted that. I thought everyone had agreed that my pain should stay buried with her. And then Clara appeared, beautiful and wealthy in a way that felt almost unreal under the dull street lamps, like she had stepped out of a world that never loses anything. She looked at me with eyes that knew too much, eyes that carried a secret I could not yet see, and she spoke Emily's name with a softness that made my knees shake. I had spent years trying to erase that sound from my mind, the memory of how I last whispered her name on a hospital floor that smelled of metal and broken promises. I had built my days like walls so I would not have to feel anything again. I worked late, avoided lights, avoided crowds, avoided Christmas itself. People said Maple Harbor looked magical in December, with its pine-scented air and the soft glow of decorations hanging from every porch. To me, it looked like a graveyard disguised as a postcard. Every bell that rang felt like the echo of the ambulance that didn't arrive in time. Every snowflake reminded me of the last night Emily laughed, the last night I believed the world was safe. Clara shattered all of that simply by standing where she didn't belong, at my daughter's grave. She touched the cold stone as if she had the right, as if she understood something sacred about the weight I carried. She whispered Emily's name like a confession, and something inside me tore open. I felt anger, fear, confusion, and a strange pull I didn't want to admit. Why would a woman like her, a woman who had everything, seek out a broken man like me? Why would she bring flowers more expensive than my monthly rent and lay them beside a little girl she had never met? That night, the snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, covering the ground like a secret trying to hide itself again. Then she made me an offer that felt like both salvation and temptation. She wanted to resurrect Emily's name, lift it out of the shadows, attach it to something big, something shining. A foundation. A children's wing. A legacy that would keep my daughter alive in ways I never could. But behind her perfect smile, behind her trembling fingers, I sensed a darkness she kept buried. Something she was trying to hide beneath generosity and charm. Something her family had buried years ago, something tied to the night I lost Emily. I didn't know yet that the truth was covered in snow, buried deep, waiting for me to dig it up with my bare hands. Before I take you further into this night that rewrote everything I thought I knew about grief, forgiveness, and the cruel mercy of Christmas, I want to ask you something. If you're listening to me now, tell me where you are. From what city, from what small corner of the world are you hearing this story of a father walking through darkness? Share it with me, and stay close, because what happened next, no one in Maple Harbor would ever imagine, least of all me. I always thought the church bells sounded different after Emily died. Before that night, it was just part of the town's background noise, something that floated over the rooftops with the smell of fresh bread from the bakery and the distant hum of traffic on the main road. It meant morning, or Sunday, or Christmas, or weddings that had nothing to do with me. But after the night in the hospital, after the machines went quiet and the nurse looked at me with eyes that could not say the words, that bell became something else. Every time it rang, I heard the echo of the last minute I still believed she would open her eyes. On that Christmas Eve, the bell started its slow, heavy ringing just as I locked the hardware store door, and it felt like the sound was aimed straight at my chest. Maple Harbor looked like a postcard that evening, the kind people put on fridges and forget. Snow sat in soft piles on fences and parked cars, the streetlights glowed with a warm yellow that tried to pretend the air wasn't freezing, and every shop window competed with the next in a silent contest of who had the brightest lights and prettiest decorations. I moved through all of it like a ghost in a worn coat, hands deep in my pockets, the smell of pine and cinnamon hitting me every few meters as people opened cafe doors and laughed their way inside. Laughter on Christmas Eve had become a strange language I no longer understood, a sound I knew I once spoke but had completely forgotten. I kept my head down as I walked, watching my boots press small holes into the snow along Main Street. Kids ran past me with their cheeks red from the cold, waving paper bags and cups of hot chocolate, leaving trails of excited words I did not want to hear. Somewhere a speaker was playing an old Christmas song, something about peace and joy, and I felt my shoulders tense automatically. Every word about peace felt like a mockery, every mention of joy like a personal insult. I could still see Emily's face the last time she watched the snow from her bedroom window, pressing her fingers against the cold glass and telling me she wanted to make a snowman taller than I was. We never got to build that snowman. The storm came, the ice took over the roads, and the night that should have been full of presents and laughter turned into blue lights, sirens, and a hospital hallway that smelled like bleach and burning hope. I told myself I was only going to the cemetery because I had finished work early and had nowhere else to be. That was the lie I liked to repeat. The truth was simpler and uglier. I did not know how to survive Christmas Eve without visiting her. I had wrapped a small gift for her that morning, the way I did every year, even though I knew she would never touch it. It was a tiny snow globe with a deer inside, nothing expensive, nothing special to anyone but me. I kept it in my pocket all day, fingers brushing against the smooth plastic as if it were some kind of anchor. When the sky started turning dark and the church bell rang again in the distance, I turned away from the warm lights of the cafes and walked toward the hill at the edge of town where the graveyard watched over us all. The snow felt different there, quieter somehow. The main road's noise faded behind me and the world shrank to the sound of my own breathing, my boots, and the crunch of ice underfoot. The iron gate complained softly when I pushed it open, as if even it was tired of seeing me come and go. I knew the path to Emily's grave by heart. I did not need the dim lamps or the names on the stones. I could have walked there with my eyes closed. Her stone was small, simple, white, with her name, 2 dates too close together, and a line I had not chosen. My sister had picked it when I could not think straight enough to decide anything. It said she was an angel now, watching over us. I never felt her watching. I only felt her absence like a constant weight. Snow had already settled on the top of the stone, soft and untouched. I brushed it off with my gloved hand, fingers trembling in a way that always surprised me. Every year I thought it would hurt less, and every year the pain came back with the same sharpness, as if no time had passed. I took the little snow globe from my pocket and placed it at the base of the stone, adjusting it so the tiny deer inside faced her name. The plastic felt cheap and light compared to the heaviness in my chest. I imagined her small fingers turning it, shaking up the fake snow inside, smiling that quick, bright smile she had when something simple made her happy. For a moment the cold air around me seemed thinner, like the world was holding its breath. The church bell rang again in the distance and I realized I was standing exactly as I had stood the night of her funeral, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the ground. People had said time would help. They were wrong. Time did not heal. Time only gave me more days to remember the sound of the doctor's voice, the feeling of her small hand slipping out of mine, the silence that came afterward like a wall. I closed my eyes and tried to pray, but the words would not come. Whatever conversation I had once had with God had ended in that hospital room. Since then, Christmas was just the anniversary of a broken promise. I do not know how long I stood there before I felt that I was no longer alone. At first it was just a shift in the air, a faint sound like footsteps muffled by snow, a presence pressing against the edge of my awareness. This was not unusual. People visited the graves of their loved ones all the time, especially on nights like this. I kept my eyes on Emily's name, not wanting to share my grief with anyone. The last thing I wanted was a pitying glance or a soft voice telling me she was in a better place. But the footsteps stopped behind me and did not move away. Whoever it was stayed there, silent, as if waiting for something. There was a hint of perfume in the air, something warm and clean that did not belong to this place of earth and stone. I finally looked up and turned my head slightly, expecting to see a neighbor or someone from town bundled in a thick coat, hugging flowers or a small candle. Instead, I saw a figure standing a few feet away, backlit by the weak yellow lamp that barely held back the dark. She was slim, tall, wrapped in a long dark coat that seemed to catch every snowflake like it had been designed for this exact scene. Her gloved hands held a bouquet of pale flowers that did not match any arrangement our town florist usually made. Everything about her looked too polished, too deliberate, too distant from the rough lives we lived here. For a moment I thought I was imagining her, some strange creation of my exhausted mind. But then she took a step closer, and the snow crunched beneath her boots, clear and undeniable. Her eyes met mine, and there it was again, that feeling that she knew something heavy and dangerous, something I would rather keep buried. She lowered her gaze slowly to the stone in front of me, to Emily's name, and I watched as her face changed. The confident lines softened, the perfect mask cracked just a little, and pain flickered there, sharp and real. It was not the polite sadness of someone offering condolences. It was the raw, guilty ache of someone standing in front of a truth they had tried to outrun. I should have asked her who she was. I should have demanded to know what she was doing at my daughter's grave, why her expensive shoes were sinking into the same snow that covered the only place I still called sacred. But my voice stayed trapped inside my chest. All I could do was stare, frozen not by the cold but by the feeling that this moment was the start of something I would not be able to control. She knelt slowly, carefully, as if every movement cost her something, and with hands that trembled just enough to be noticed, she placed her pale flowers beside the cheap snow globe I had brought. Her lips moved then, forming a name I did not expect to hear from a stranger, a name that had not been spoken aloud in my presence for a long time. Even though the wind stole most of the sound, I knew exactly what she said. Emily. My daughter's name floated between us in the cold air like a fragile ornament that could shatter at any moment. The bell in the distance kept ringing, slow and heavy, marking the time. I realized with a sudden chill that this was the first Christmas Eve since Emily's death in which I was not alone at her grave. And the woman who had broken that lonely ritual, this beautiful stranger with rich clothes and haunted eyes, looked at me as if my pain and hers were tied together by a secret neither of us was ready to speak yet. For a long heartbeat after she whispered Emily's name, we just stayed there, the three of us, a broken father, a buried child, and a stranger who did not belong in that frozen picture. The wind moved softly through the branches of the bare trees, brushing off little puffs of snow that fell like silent confetti over the stones. I watched one of those tiny clumps land on the perfect black leather of her boots and cling there, stubbornly refusing to slide off. It was such a small thing, but it struck me that even the snow in Maple Harbor was trying to hold on to her, as if afraid she might vanish as suddenly as she had appeared. I did not ask her who she was. There was something in the way her shoulders were set, in the tight curve of her mouth, that told me she was carrying a weight of her own. For a few seconds I almost felt guilty, as if grief were a room too small to share and I had forgotten that other people might be bleeding too. But then I remembered the flowers in her hands, the elegance of her clothes, the faint trace of an expensive perfume that did not belong to this cold hill, and the guilt turned back into suspicion. This cemetery had always been a place of worn jackets, old scarves, hands reddened by cold and work. It was where people came with thrift store coats and supermarket flowers, where they kneeled with damp jeans and boots that leaked at the edges. She didn't fit. Her long coat fell perfectly, the fabric heavy and smooth, the gloves on her hands soft and precise. The bouquet she placed beside the snow globe was made of pale roses, their petals untouched by frost, tied with a silk ribbon that shone even in the dim light. It was as if she had walked directly out of some glossy magazine and onto my daughter's grave. She stayed kneeling for a moment, eyes closed, lips moving in a prayer or an apology I could not hear. I felt an urge rise in me, sharp and ugly, to tell her to leave, to pick up her flowers and her perfume and go mourn her own losses somewhere else. This patch of earth was all I had left, and I did not want it contaminated by her mystery. But when she finally stood up and turned fully toward me, the words died before they reached my tongue. Up close, her face was not as perfect as it had first seemed. The beauty was there, yes, the kind that turned heads and filled rooms with a strange, quiet attention. But beneath it, I saw lines of tension around her mouth, faint shadows under her eyes, a tightness in the way she held her jaw that spoke of sleepless nights and swallowed words. Her gaze did not slide past me like most people's did when they did not know what to say. It settled on me, steady and searching, like she was looking for someone she had been trying to find for a long time. The urge to break the silence warred with the stubborn part of me that had survived by not asking questions. I had learned that answers rarely brought comfort. They just exposed new layers of pain. So I stayed quiet. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the distant sound of a car passing on the main road and the faint echo of the church bell's last tones fading into the air. The world felt far away up here. It was just us and the stone between us. She spoke first, but the words were so soft they barely reached me. I heard my daughter's name again, wrapped in an apology that made my throat tighten. Then she said something else, something about always coming too late, about never being able to fix what really mattered. I didn't respond. I couldn't trust my voice. Instead, I watched her as she looked back down at Emily's name, her eyes shining with something that looked disturbingly like guilt. Deep-rooted guilt. Not the temporary discomfort of someone witnessing another's pain, but the heavy, choking kind that eats away at a person from the inside. That was when something inside me shifted. Until that moment, I had assumed she was a stranger who had heard a tragic story in a small town and decided to pay some kind of delicate respect. People did that sometimes, out of pity or religion or their own need to feel kind. But the way she looked at that stone told me this was not about charity. This was personal. My fingers curled inside my gloves, nails biting into my palms. Questions pressed at my tongue, thick and desperate. How do you know her name? Why are you here? What did Emily ever mean to you? I opened my mouth, finally ready to demand answers, but the wind rose at that moment, flinging a burst of snow between us like a curtain. I blinked, and when my eyes cleared, she was already turning away, her coat sweeping behind her like a dark wing. She walked back down the path with careful steps, as if the ground might break under her, leaving no trace of her weight. I watched her until the night swallowed her silhouette, until all that remained was the memory of her perfume and the pale ghost of her flowers beside the cheap plastic snow globe. I stood there long after she had gone, my mind a mess of sharp, scattered thoughts. Part of me tried to convince the rest that this did not matter. She was just someone passing through, someone who had heard Emily's story in a grocery line or a cafe and decided to stop by the cemetery. That happened, didn't it? People were curious. People were drawn to tragedies that weren't theirs. But no matter how I tried to frame it, something wouldn't fit. Strangers did not look at my daughter's grave like they were standing in front of their own execution. Strangers did not whisper apologies with their hands shaking. The snow began to fall heavier, flakes growing larger, wetter, sticking to my coat and my hair. My toes were numb in my worn boots, my fingers stiff, but I could not bring myself to leave, not immediately. It felt wrong to turn my back on Emily after what had just happened, as if I were abandoning her to the company of someone I did not understand. I whispered a few clumsy words to her, words that were not really prayers but not quite curses either, and then I forced myself to walk back down the path and out into the town lights. On the way home, every detail seemed sharper, as if someone had adjusted the focus on the world. The bakery's warm light spilled onto the street, turning the snow outside almost golden. A group of teenagers huddled near the bus stop, faces glowing blue from their phones, Santa hats crooked on their heads. Across the road, Mr. Harris was dragging his trash bin back from the curb, his old wool coat buttoned wrong as usual. He lifted a hand when he saw me, a brief, tired motion, and I nodded back. The normality of these small scenes felt both comforting and unreal, like set pieces in a theater where the main actor had forgotten his lines. I did not see her again that night. At least, that's what I told myself as I locked the door of my small apartment, dropped my keys on the table, and stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the distant murmur of the town. But when I closed my eyes, she was there, in the snow, by the stone, her face caught between luxury and ruin. I made myself a cup of instant coffee I didn't really want, the bitter smell filling the tiny kitchen, and tried to push her out of my mind. I focused instead on the rituals that had kept me afloat since Emily died, taking off my boots in the same corner, hanging my coat on the same hook, checking the old picture frame on the shelf to make sure her smile hadn't faded. Sleep did not come easily. It rarely did, but that night it stayed even farther away than usual. I lay in the dark, listening to the radiator hiss and click, watching the faint glow of the street lamp draw a pale stripe across the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her again in that graveyard, heard the way she said Emily's name, felt the unspoken weight hanging between us. I told myself I would forget her by morning. That this was just another strange moment in a long line of strange moments that grief had carved out of my days. But morning did not bring forgetfulness. It brought something else. When I walked into the hardware store the next day, shaking the snow from my shoulders, I saw her again. She stood near the back, out of place among the shelves of nails, paint cans, and cheap tools, her dark coat open now, revealing a soft gray sweater that probably cost more than everything I wore combined. She held a small piece of paper in one gloved hand, as if she had written down what she needed to say. When her eyes met mine, there was no surprise. Only a quiet, grim kind of certainty, as if this was exactly where she had always planned to find me. That was the moment I understood that her presence at Emily's grave had not been an accident. When I saw Clara standing in the back of the hardware store, framed between shelves of worn cardboard boxes and dusty cans of varnish, the same cold that lived in the cemetery slid down my spine again. She didn't fit there. Not with her flawless coat, her calm posture, her deliberate stillness. The store was a place of splinters, rusted tools, cheap gloves and men who smelled of motor oil. She looked like she had stepped inside by mistake, yet nothing in her expression suggested confusion. She stood like someone who had come with purpose, someone who already knew the outcome before speaking a single word. I felt my heartbeat shift into something heavy, the way it used to when the hospital phone rang at night. My hands stiffened around the keys I had just placed on the counter. She wasn't supposed to be here. The graveyard could have been coincidence. A strange, hurtful, impossible coincidence, but still something I might have forced myself to ignore. But this, her standing here in my store, waiting in silence, this broke any illusion of accident. She had followed me. Or she had planned something long before our paths crossed. Both options tasted the same inside me, dread. Mr. Harris, who spent every morning wandering between aisles pretending to need things he never bought, glanced at her with a confused frown. Customers in Maple Harbor rarely wore anything more formal than flannel shirts. Seeing someone like Clara here was like spotting a swan in a muddy pond. He gave her a wide berth and quietly slipped out, as if her presence meant something solemn was about to unfold and he didn't want to be caught in the middle of it. The store fell silent. Outside, the snow tapped lightly on the windows like impatient fingers. The heater in the corner hummed with an uneven rhythm, filling the air with a dry warmth that didn't reach me. Clara stepped forward, slow, measured, each movement too graceful for a place where everything was crooked, dusty, and worn down by life. She held that small paper tighter now, the edge trembling between her fingers. When she stopped in front of the counter, I smelled that same perfume from the cemetery, warm and clean, a scent that didn't belong to grief. She lifted the paper slightly, though she didn't look at it. Her gaze stayed locked on mine, steady and unsettling. She said my name, not sir, not excuse me, not anything casual. She said David, softly, like someone tasting something they already know too well. Hearing my name and her voice stirred a strange anger inside me, an instinct to protect the pieces of my life she had no right to touch. I didn't answer. I just stared, waiting for whatever she had come to say. My silence didn't scare her. If anything, it made her exhale slowly, as if she had prepared herself for rejection. She placed the folded paper on the counter between us. The white sheet looked unbearably bright against the stained wood. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I watched her hand retreat, fingers curling, tightening as though she had to keep herself from grabbing the paper back again. That was the first sign of vulnerability I truly saw in her, something raw beneath the surface. Her voice, when it finally came, was controlled, but I could hear a fracture beneath the calm. She told me she knew who I was. She told me she had known for longer than I could imagine. She said Emily's full name again, middle name included, the one I almost never said aloud. Hearing it inside these walls, this store where Emily once sat on the counter swinging her legs while I worked, made something inside me clench hard. Only a few people alive knew Emily's full name. It wasn't written on her stone. It wasn't in the newspaper article. It wasn't something anyone could stumble across. The way Clara said it, slow, deliberate, felt like a knife sliding beneath my ribs, not to kill, but to pry open a wound she already suspected existed. Cold washed through me. I told myself to stay calm, to breathe, to remember that grief twists perception. But no amount of rational thinking could explain how she knew details that belonged solely to me and my daughter. She told me she had followed Emily's story for years. That she had wanted to reach out many times but had not found the courage. She said she admired the way I kept her memory alive, that she believed some names deserved to echo longer than life itself. Her words felt smooth and polished, but her hands told a different story, clenching and unclenching, betraying a tension that made me suspect she wasn't here because of admiration alone. She talked about the foundation she wanted to build in Emily's honor. A children's wing, a safe place for families who needed hope. Her voice warmed when she described it, as if she could see those hallways already glowing with possibility. She spoke of giving Emily a legacy that wouldn't fade, of transforming loss into light. Part of me felt the air catch in my chest at that. To hear my daughter's name tied to something living, something hopeful, it stirred an ache that almost resembled longing. But the other part of me, the part that had survived by distrusting anything too beautiful, too sudden, too perfect, whispered that none of this made sense. Why would a wealthy woman I had never met care so deeply about a child she had no connection to? Why had she stood at her grave with tears she tried to hide? Why did she look at me as if she owed me something enormous, something dangerous? Her words began to unravel then, not in meaning but in feeling. She said she wanted to make things right. She said she had come to give, not to take. But somewhere between her sentences, I felt a dark undercurrent, something heavy and unspoken slipping through the cracks. She wasn't telling me everything. She wasn't even close. My hands finally moved toward the folded paper on the counter. When I picked it up, I expected a brochure, a donation form, a sketch of the foundation she mentioned. Instead, I found a list, dates, locations, small notes written in a precise, elegant handwriting. Every line had one thing in common: Emily. School events. Hospital records. Her birthday. The day she died. The anniversary of the funeral. The breath left my body like a punch. She had been watching my daughter's life, and her death, for years. The storm that rose inside me was quiet but violent, a tight knot of grief, suspicion, and something close to fear. I lifted my eyes to hers, demanding an explanation without needing to speak. She froze for a second, a flicker of panic breaking through her composure. Her lips parted, but no words came out. That silence told me more than any speech could have. She knew something she shouldn't. Something buried. Something deadly. Before I could force the truth out of her, she turned away, as if afraid that if she stayed 1 second longer, everything she carried would spill. At the door she paused, hand trembling on the frame, and whispered that she would return. That she had something more to tell me. That she hoped, dear God, she hoped I would listen. Then she stepped into the snow and disappeared again, leaving me with a list of secrets tied to the name of the child I lost. I didn't know it then, but this was the moment the past began to claw its way back. This was the moment I should have understood that Clara's grief wasn't about my daughter at all, but about what her family had done to mine. I didn't see Clara again for 3 days after she left the store, but her presence stayed with me like a shadow stitched to my thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that folded sheet with Emily's dates written in elegant strokes, so precise it looked almost ceremonial. I kept telling myself to throw it away, to burn it, to erase every trace of whatever strange obsession she had with my daughter. But I couldn't. The paper lay on my kitchen table, untouched, yet alive, as if the ink itself pulsed with questions I was too afraid to ask. On the 4th day, Christmas Eve morning, I found an envelope slipped beneath my apartment door. My name was written in the same careful handwriting, and when I opened it, I felt the room tilt. Inside was a single card printed on thick, white paper. An invitation. A request to meet her at the old lakeside lodge at dusk. A place wealthy families used for celebrations or retreats, far from town, surrounded by pine trees and the quiet stillness of water frozen into glass. Part of me wanted to tear it up. Another part, heavier and more stubborn, whispered that this was the only way to understand what she was hiding. And so I went. The sky was already darkening when I reached the lodge. Snow had begun to fall in slow, patient flakes that drifted through the air like tiny pieces of ash. The place stood silent, its wooden exterior coated in frost, its windows glowing with warm golden light. For a moment I hesitated on the steps, listening to the muffled sound of soft music somewhere inside. I felt like an intruder in a world built for people who never had to count their losses in hospital hallways. When I pushed the door open, I found her standing near the fireplace, her coat gone, her posture tense despite the warmth of the flames behind her. She turned toward me with that same mixture of determination and fragility, as if every breath she took carried the weight of something she wasn't ready to release. A table was set between us, lit by a single candle. And on the table lay a stack of papers bound neatly together. A contract. I stepped toward it slowly, feeling the lodge's wooden floor shift beneath my boots. The scent of pine logs burning in the fireplace filled the room, mingling with the faint perfume I remembered from the cemetery. Clara's eyes followed mine as I approached the table, but she didn't speak. She seemed to be waiting for the moment I touched the documents, as if that act alone would bind me to everything she had planned. When I reached out and lifted the top page, my breath caught. At first it looked like a formal proposal for the foundation she had mentioned, with architectural sketches of a children's wing, legal language about funding, partnerships, and naming rights. But as I turned the pages, the tone shifted. There were clauses about my involvement, about my presence, my consent, my cooperation. Requirements that didn't make sense for a simple tribute to my daughter. Then I saw the final section. It wasn't written in legal terms. It wasn't dressed in business language. It was personal. She wanted something more than a partnership. More than a foundation. More than a legacy. She wanted a child. My hands went cold, the warmth of the lodge disappearing under the weight of her words. She wanted me to be the father. She wanted, in her own trembling phrasing, to create a life that carried both hope and redemption. She asked for something I had buried with Emily, the possibility of becoming a father again. As if she believed this could undo the damage carved into my bones. I looked up at her then, really looked, and saw the truth behind her determination. This wasn't confidence. This wasn't manipulation. This was desperation. The kind of desperation only someone carrying unbearable guilt could feel. She moved toward the table, her voice soft, explaining that the foundation wouldn't just honor Emily, it would honor the child she wanted to bring into the world. She spoke of healing, of new beginnings, of second chances forged from broken pieces. But beneath her words, I heard something darker. Something she didn't say. Something she was terrified I would discover. Her family. The accident. The connection to my daughter's death. The weight of it all pressed against my chest until breathing felt like a task I had forgotten how to do. I asked her why, though it came out more like a whisper than a question. Why me? Why this? Why now? She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said she believed I was the only person who could understand what it meant to lose everything and still choose to build something out of the ruins. I should have walked out. I should have told her that I would never sign anything, never give her what she wanted, never touch a life twisted so tightly with secrets she refused to speak. But something held me there. Maybe it was the way her hands trembled at her sides. Maybe it was the hollow ache I recognized in her eyes, the same ache I saw in my reflection whenever I passed a mirror. Or maybe it was the cruel truth I didn't want to admit, part of me missed being needed. Missed being someone's beginning instead of someone's end. The clock above the fireplace chimed softly, marking 6 o'clock. Christmas Eve had officially begun. Outside the window, snow coated the world in silence, erasing footprints, smoothing over every rough edge. For a moment the room felt suspended, caught between past and future, grief and something dangerously close to hope. Then Clara stepped closer, and her voice broke. She said she couldn't carry the truth alone anymore. She said the contract wasn't just an agreement, it was a confession waiting for the right moment to be spoken aloud. And she told me that if I agreed to hear her story, truly hear it, she would tell me everything. The truth about why she found me. The truth about why she knew Emily's name. The truth about what her family had done to the daughter I had buried. My knees felt weak. My fingers loosened on the contract. The heat of the fire pressed against my back, but a cold deeper than winter settled inside me. She looked at me with eyes drowning in remorse and begged, not with words, but with silence, for one more chance to make things right. When I finally stepped back from the table, the candle flickered violently, as if sensing the shift inside me. I told her without speaking that I couldn't sign anything, not yet. Maybe not ever. But I would listen. I would give her that much. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. It was a step toward a truth I had spent years running from. Clara nodded, her shoulders collapsing in relief and dread. She said she would return tomorrow. Christmas Day. The day everything would change. As I left the lodge, snow settled thick on my coat. The world outside was dark and quiet, but inside me something had begun to tremble, something old, something buried, something alive. I didn't know it yet, but the truth she carried would tear my world open. And the price of hearing it would be far greater than I imagined. I barely slept the night before Christmas. The lodge, the contract, Clara's trembling voice, they replayed in my mind like scenes from a film I had never agreed to watch. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her hands clutching the papers, her eyes shimmering with fear and a guilt so deep it felt older than both of us. I lay awake in the dark, listening to the radiator hiss, watching the faint glow of streetlights bleed through the thin curtains. Somewhere in the building a TV murmured a Christmas movie laugh track, soft and out of place, drifting through the walls like a reminder that the rest of the world was living a different holiday entirely. By dawn, exhaustion settled into my bones, but it did nothing to quiet the storm in my mind. Clara wanted to meet again that afternoon. She had promised to tell me everything. The truth about why she had followed Emily's life and death, why she had appeared at her grave, why she wanted a child with me, why she carried sorrow like a second skin. I tried to prepare myself for whatever she might reveal, but every attempt ended with the same hollow pit in my stomach. There were only two kinds of truths people feared to speak, those that would hurt others, and those that would destroy themselves. When I stepped outside, the cold slapped my face sharply, grounding me for a moment. Snow had fallen heavily through the night, thickening the world into a muted blur of white. The streets were nearly empty, just the occasional car crawling through the drifts and a few bundled figures shoveling their steps. Christmas Day had a strange, muffled silence to it, like the whole town was holding its breath. I walked to the cemetery first. I don't know why I felt the need to go there before meeting her again. Maybe because I wanted Emily close, even if only in the quiet way grief allows. Maybe because I wanted to remember what I had already survived before walking into whatever fresh storm Clara carried. Her snow globe sat exactly where I had left it, half buried now beneath the night's snowfall. I brushed it off gently, the cheap plastic cold beneath my fingers. The tiny deer inside stared back at me, forever trapped in its little winter world, unaware that snow was supposed to melt, that childhood was supposed to last longer. I whispered Emily's name, letting it settle into the still air like a promise. Then I turned toward the path again. Clara was already waiting near the cemetery gate. She didn't look like the woman from the lodge. That Clara had been polished, deliberate, clinging to control the way a drowning person clings to air. This Clara looked undone. Her coat hung open despite the cold, snowflakes clinging to her hair. Her eyes were swollen, the skin beneath them bruised by sleeplessness. She wasn't wearing perfume. She wasn't carrying flowers. She wasn't hiding behind anything anymore. When she saw me, something flickered across her face, not relief, not fear, but a quiet resignation. As if she knew there was no path forward except through the ruin she was about to hand me. We walked. Not to the lodge. Not to the store. Not anywhere warm. She led me down the old service road that curved behind Maple Harbor, the one that was rarely plowed, where pines leaned over the guardrails like tired ghosts. The silence grew heavier with each step. My boots sank into the snow, leaving deep prints behind us. Her steps were softer, careful, almost hesitant. Finally she stopped at a bend in the road. A place where the trees thinned, and the frozen lake glimmered faintly through gaps in the branches. The air here felt different, sharp, still, almost watchful. She turned to me slowly, her breath misting in the cold, and said this was where everything had changed. This was where the accident had happened. My throat tightened. I knew the location described in the police report, but I had refused to visit it all these years. The idea of standing where Emily took her last breath made my lungs feel heavy, my heart unstable. Yet here I was, feet planted in the snow, the truth swelling in the silence between us. Clara's voice cracked when she finally spoke. She said that on the night of the accident, her brother had been driving their family's car. A luxury vehicle, large and heavy, the kind that didn't lose control easily. He had been drinking. Not enough to stumble, but enough to dull his reflexes. Enough to turn ice into a weapon. When Emily slipped on the road, when the storm blinded the street, when fate placed her tiny body at the worst possible angle, he didn't stop fast enough. Her family hid everything. They had money, power, lawyers, silence. They swept the truth under snow and darkness, paying off the right people, erasing records, smoothing over timelines. They let the world believe the storm was fully to blame. They let me bury my daughter thinking nature had stolen her from me, not a man too cowardly to face what he'd done. Clara had known for years. Her voice broke completely as she confessed it. She had been a teenager when it happened, old enough to understand, too young to fight the machinery of her family's fear. She carried that guilt into adulthood like a chain that tightened every Christmas. She said Emily's name had haunted her more than any judge or conscience could have. She said her family might have buried the truth, but it never stayed dead inside her. Then she told me the part that felt like the ground cracked beneath my feet. She had come to Maple Harbor because she thought giving me a new child, one created from forgiveness, from her own bloodline but untainted by her family's sins, might somehow restore what had been taken. Not replace Emily. Nothing could. But soften the weight. Bring light where her family had brought darkness. Her plan was not logical. It was desperate. Delusional. Maybe even cruel. But in her trembling voice, in the way she stared at the snow as if she wished it would swallow her whole, I understood she believed it was the only way left to atone for something she hadn't personally done but had lived with every day. My chest burned. I wanted to shout. To accuse. To hit the frozen ground with my fists and scream until the trees shook. But no sound came out. Instead, a numbness spread through me, an icy, hollow quiet that felt more dangerous than rage. I looked at the bend in the road, at the place where the world had ended for me once before. Snow settled gently over it, softening the edges, pretending it wasn't a grave of sorts. The wind carried a faint whistle, like a breath caught between two worlds. Finally, I asked her why she told me now. She whispered that carrying the truth alone had become unbearable. That she couldn't build a foundation on lies. That if I was ever going to make a choice about her, about the contract, about the child she hoped for, I deserved to know what really happened on that frozen night. Then she said something that hollowed me out entirely. She told me she was already pregnant. The world didn't move for a long time. The trees stood still. The snow fell soundlessly. My breath frosted the air in front of me but didn't feel like it belonged to my body. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, not expecting comfort, not asking for it. She only stood there, small, broken, waiting for the judgment she knew she deserved. When I finally turned away from her, I didn't look back. I couldn't. The truth had found me, heavy and merciless, and it followed me down the road like a second shadow. I had wanted answers. Now I had them. And they were colder than the snow beneath my feet. I didn't feel my legs as I walked away from Clara. The snow was deep, the cold cut through my coat, but none of it reached me. My body moved because it had to, but my mind stayed frozen back on that bend in the road where she had dropped the truth like a stone into black water. Her brother. Their money. The silence. The lies I had unknowingly lived under for years. And then her final blow, the one that seemed to echo louder than anything else she had confessed. She was already pregnant. The words pulsed inside my skull like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I replayed them over and over, trying to make them fit into some version of reality where they didn't shatter everything. But they did. They shattered the road behind me, the snow beneath me, the air around me, the life I thought I had left. And yet, as I trudged back toward town, the piece that hurt the most wasn't even the pregnancy, it was the realization that she had carried all this alone for years, waiting for a moment she believed could rewrite something unforgivable. The sky had begun to darken by the time I reached my apartment, turning the snow into a dull gray blanket. The town was quiet, Christmas quiet, the kind of quiet where families stay indoors and fireplaces burn steady, and the world outside feels like it's holding its breath. Lights twinkled on roofs and porches, but all I felt was their cold reflection on my skin. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. I closed the door, leaned my back against it, and slid to the floor. For a long time I didn't move. I stared at the stillness of the room, the familiar shadows, the framed photo of Emily perched on the shelf. She was smiling in it, her hair pulled back, her cheeks flushed from running in the snow outside the store years ago. I had taken the picture without thinking, one of those small moments that became an anchor when everything else fell apart. Now her little face looked back at me with a question I couldn't answer. What would you say, Emily? Would she tell me to forgive? To keep walking forward? Or would she ask me why I ever let Clara close enough to speak her name? I pressed my hands over my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. My mind kept replaying Clara's confession, layering the words with the ache in her voice, the way her shoulders had folded as if the truth had been crushing her for years. She wasn't trying to excuse anything. She wasn't trying to be redeemed. She was drowning in guilt, and she thought, hoped, prayed that bringing a child into the world with me might somehow lift her back to the surface. But forgiveness doesn't work that way. Redemption doesn't come in contracts or planned futures. And no child, not mine, not hers, should ever be born from the ruins of a tragedy covered up with money. I stood slowly, legs shaking, and walked to the kitchen sink. I turned on the faucet, splashed cold water onto my face. I could still taste the metallic edge of shock on my tongue. I gripped the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles went white. Pregnant. The word echoed again, softer this time, but heavier. My breath caught. A child. Another child. Another heartbeat. Another tiny body depending on mine. After Emily died, I had buried not just my daughter, I had buried the version of myself that believed I could ever be a father again. I had sealed that part of me away in grief, convinced the world had already decided I didn't deserve a second chance. And yet here it was. A second chance delivered by the person whose family had stolen the first one from me. A cruel miracle. A twisted blessing. A unbearable crossroads. My phone vibrated on the counter, startling me. When I looked at the screen, her name was there. Clara. I didn't answer. Couldn't. The phone buzzed again and again, then went still. The silence afterward felt heavier than the sound. I stared at the screen until it dimmed, showing my reflection faintly, eyes tired, face gray, a man split clean down the middle. I paced because standing still felt impossible. The room was too small for the storm boiling inside me. Every breath I took built pressure against my ribs. I stopped at the window, stared out at the snow-covered street. Christmas lights blinked on the house across the road, soft and warm, as if nothing in the world was broken. Somewhere a family laughed. Somewhere a child shook a gift box. Somewhere hope was simple and untouched. I closed the curtain. When the knock came at my door, I knew before I opened it who it was. Clara stood there, hunched slightly against the cold, her cheeks flushed red from the wind. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her coat was dusted with snow. She looked younger, smaller, more fragile than ever, as if telling the truth had stripped away whatever armor she had once carried. Her hands were buried deep inside her sleeves, and when she lifted her eyes to mine, The weight of everything unsaid filled the space between us like a third presence. She didn't try to come in. She didn't speak. She just waited, trembling lightly, her breath rising in white clouds that dissolved before reaching me. I hated how familiar that trembling looked. It reminded me of myself at the hospital, of the way grief shakes the body even when the heart is numb. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. She whispered my name. The sound cracked like thin ice. I told her she shouldn't have come. My voice didn't rise, I didn't have the strength for anger, but the words hit her like a blow. Her chin wavered. She swallowed hard, hands clasped in front of her now, as if she were praying. She said she needed to see me. That she needed me to know she didn't expect forgiveness. That she understood if I never wanted to see her again. But she wanted me to hear one thing she hadn't been brave enough to say earlier. The child wasn't part of her family's plan. It wasn't something arranged or manipulated. It wasn't meant to be an offering or a bargain. She wanted the baby. She had wanted it long before she told me. And she was terrified that this child, the one she hoped would bring light into a life that had been dimmed by lies and guilt, would now be born into hatred. For a moment, everything stopped. Even the wind held still. The world shrank to her voice, quiet, breaking, anchored in something painfully real. Then she placed a trembling hand over her stomach. It was barely noticeable beneath her coat, barely a curve. But it was real. A heartbeat inside her. A chance I never asked for. A life tied to mine whether I accepted it or not. I stepped back. I didn't mean to. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. Clara's face fell, the last flicker of hope dropping from her eyes like a faint spark dying in the snow. She whispered that she would leave town. That she would raise the child alone. That she only told me because she believed I deserved the truth even if the truth took everything else away. Then she turned and walked into the falling snow, her figure blurring with each step until she disappeared completely, swallowed by the same winter that had once taken my daughter. I stood on the porch long after she was gone, breath shaking in the cold, my hand gripping the railing to keep myself from collapsing. The truth had finally surfaced. And now everything that came next depended on a man who no longer trusted his own heart. I didn't leave the porch for a long time after Clara disappeared into the snow. The cold knotted my skin, crawled up my sleeves, seeped into my bones, but I barely felt it. My mind was somewhere far away, trapped between the past I had never fully faced and the future I was now terrified to touch. A child. Her child. My child. The words circled like a storm, picking up pieces of memory, fear, guilt, and something softer, something I was too ashamed to name. When I finally stepped back inside, the apartment felt colder than the porch. The silence pressed in on me like a weight, and Emily's picture on the shelf seemed to watch me with a calmness I couldn't bear. I sank onto the couch, elbows on my knees, hands covering my face. For the first time in years, I wished I could hear her voice. I wished for some sign, some whisper that would tell me whether moving toward Clara was betrayal or grace. But the world stayed quiet. Days passed like a thick fog. I went to work. I ate when I remembered. I slept in restless fragments. Every time my mind drifted, it found its way back to the curve of Clara's hand over her stomach, the tremor in her voice when she said she wanted the baby, the desperation in her eyes when she thought she had already lost me. I tried to bury the image under anger at her family, at her silence, at the years stolen from me. But the anger cracked each time I remembered the way she walked away alone, protecting a life she feared I would reject. I didn't call her. I didn't seek her. And she didn't return. Not for a week. Not for two. The quiet became unbearable. Then, on a night thick with wind and heavy clouds, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I had grown used to letting calls go unanswered, letting the world fade. But something in the tone, sharp, urgent, cut through the numbness. When I lifted the receiver, a nurse's voice rushed into my ear, clipped and anxious. Clara had collapsed. Complications. Severe bleeding. They were trying to stabilize her. And she was asking for me, only me. I don't remember running down the stairs, or pulling on my coat, or how I got to the truck. I only remember the roar of the engine tearing through the night, the tires slipping on ice, the wind slicing across the windshield. The roads blurred past in streaks of white and black. Snow fell hard, driven sideways by the storm. It felt like the world was trying to swallow everything before I could reach it. Maple Harbor General was lit up against the dark like a lighthouse, the glow sharp against the swirling snow. I slid into the parking lot crooked, not even bothering to straighten the truck. I ran inside, boots thudding, breath burning my lungs. The nurse recognized me immediately. She said Clara was losing too much blood. She said the baby was too early. She said they couldn't wait. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and something else, fear, quiet and metallic. A Christmas wreath hung unevenly on one wall, its red ribbon wilted, its bells silent. Somewhere down the corridor someone was laughing, the kind of laugh people force when they're trying not to think about the room next door. They led me to a chair outside the operating room. The door swung shut with a soft, final sound, and I felt the world narrow to a single point. My hands shook uncontrollably. My breath stuttered. The air tasted like dust. For a moment, I saw Emily again, not in a memory, but in the shape of fear that gripped me. I saw the hospital hallway from years ago, the fluorescent lights too bright, the floor cold under my knees, the doctor's voice blurring into static. I felt myself slipping back into that night, the night I lost everything. I stood up suddenly, the walls closing in, and pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window. Snowflakes smacked softly against it from the outside. I whispered her name Emily, not as a prayer but as an anchor. I needed her to hold me steady, even if only in memory. Then another name rose out of my chest, trembling and unwanted. Clara. I hated myself for feeling it, but I couldn't deny it. Beneath the betrayal, the guilt, the twisted history of what her family had done, there was something else. Something I had tried to crush. Something that had grown in the spaces between our grief. I cared for her. A sharp cry snapped me back. A nurse rushed past with blood bags. Another hurried the opposite direction with a tray of instruments. The storm outside pounded against the windows, the wind howling like a warning or a plea. Minutes stretched into hours. My body was rigid with tension, every muscle coiled, my mind racing through 1,000 futures, each one ending in the same dark place I had already been once. Then the door opened. A doctor stepped out, mask pulled down, exhaustion etched into his expression. I braced myself. The world held its breath. He said they managed to stop the bleeding. He said Clara was stable, barely, but stable. He said the baby was alive. Alive. The word hit me like a blow. A strange mixture of relief and terror rushed through me, leaving my knees weak. The doctor placed a hand on my shoulder, guiding me down a corridor toward the neonatal unit. The room was small, warm, filled with soft beeping and the quiet hum of machines. And there, inside a tiny incubator, was a life I knew nothing about yet was already tied to in ways I couldn't escape. The baby was impossibly small, skin translucent, chest rising and falling in fragile little movements. A tube rested near its nose. A knitted hat, too big, rested gently on its head. I stepped closer, breath shaking. I didn't know how to name the feeling inside me. It wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't fear alone. It was something deeper, something that came from a place older than words. A spark of responsibility. A tether. A beginning I didn't ask for but couldn't walk away from. The nurse asked if I wanted to touch the incubator. My hand trembled as I reached out. The warmth of the glass met my palm, and behind it, the baby stirred, one tiny movement, barely noticeable. Behind me, I heard a soft, strained whisper. "David." I turned. Clara stood in the doorway, pale, exhausted, leaning on a nurse for support. Her eyes were glassy, rimmed with tears, her lips trembling. She looked at me not with expectation, not with hope, but with sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. I walked to her slowly, each step heavy. When I reached her, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes were saying everything. I almost lost them. Both of them. Because of truth. Because of lies. Because of the past neither of us chose. In that moment, I didn't forgive her. But I didn't turn away. For the first time since Emily died, I stepped toward something instead of running from it. And the night shifted. Quietly. Irreversibly. The night after Clara almost slipped away passed without shape or measure, stretched thin by the dim hospital lights and the slow rhythm of machines that kept her alive. I sat in the chair beside her bed, listening to the soft rise and fall of her breathing, feeling the weight of everything that had brought us to that room. The storm outside had quieted, leaving the windows covered in frost, and the world felt suspended, as if waiting for a decision I still didn't know how to make. I stayed awake because sleep felt like surrender, and I was not ready to let go of the fragile thread connecting her life and the child's life to mine. When morning came, the sky over Maple Harbor was pale and empty, a sheet of washed-out light stretching over the town. Nurses moved quietly through the hall, their voices low, carrying trays and charts, adjusting blankets, checking vitals. I watched them with a strange sense of distance, feeling both present and far away, as if grief had peeled back a layer of the world and left everything raw and silent. I rose from the chair and walked slowly toward the neonatal unit, the smell of disinfectant and warm air filling the space like a heavy memory. Inside the unit, the machines hummed steadily. The baby lay curled in the incubator, a fragile cluster of limbs and breath, skin translucent and small fingers twitching as if dreaming already. I stood there without moving, letting the sight settle into me like a weight I wasn't sure I could carry. Yet something in the way that tiny chest rose and fell began to pull at places inside me I thought had died with Emily. The feeling wasn't sudden or dramatic, it was quiet, a slow warmth creeping through cold ground. I didn't touch the incubator this time. I just stood there and allowed myself to acknowledge that this small being was real, and alive, and connected to me. I thought of Emily then, not with the sharp pain that usually came, but with a distant ache, the way a scar pulls when the weather shifts. I pictured her small hand in mine as we crossed the store aisle years ago, her steps skipping, her laughter ringing in the air. She had believed the world was wide and kind, that snow was magic, that Christmas lights were tiny stars brought down to earth. Standing before the incubator, I realized that part of me had frozen on the night she died, preserved under layers of fear and guilt. And now this child, silent and trembling beneath tubes and blankets, was cracking through that ice without even knowing it. I wasn't ready to call it hope, but it felt like something close. Later, when Clara woke, her voice was barely a murmur, her body fragile under the weight of blood loss and fear. I sat beside her again, watching her eyelids flutter, and for the first time I saw her without any of the masks she had worn before. She was not the wealthy woman from the graveyard, not the determined figure from the lodge, not the trembling confession on the frozen road. She was simply human, tired, broken, caught in a story she hadn't chosen and didn't know how to escape. Her guilt had carved deep lines in her expression, but beneath them I saw something else too, something almost invisible, a desire to build something different from the ruins she inherited. She turned her face slightly toward me, her eyes struggling to focus, and I felt a shift inside me that I didn't fight this time. I didn't reach for her, but I didn't move away either. The nurse came in then, bringing news that the baby had stabilized through the night. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a beginning. Clara closed her eyes, her breath trembling, and I watched her relief spill into the blanket like a quiet confession. She didn't speak, but her shoulders loosened, her hands relaxed, and for a moment the room felt less heavy. I stood and followed the nurse back to the neonatal unit, unable to ignore the pull that had begun to anchor me there. The baby looked almost unchanged, still small, still fragile, but something in me was different now. I felt a thread connecting that incubator to the hospital bed where Clara slept, to the grave where Emily lay beneath winter snow, to the man I had been before the world collapsed. Everything was woven into one line, stretching across years and decisions, pain and secrets, guilt and trembling beginnings. I stood there until the nurse gently nudged me aside to check the monitors, and then I stepped back into the hall, unable to stop the silent thought forming inside me: this child had no part in the sins that brought them into the world. They were untouched by the road that had taken Emily. They were untouched by money, lies, guilt. They were simply alive. As the afternoon light softened through the hospital windows, I returned to Clara's room. She looked stronger now, sitting upright, a blanket over her legs, her face pale but calmer. She watched me enter, and something in her gaze shifted, not expecting forgiveness but bracing for whatever version of me would walk through that door. I sat down, feeling the chair creak beneath my weight, and the silence between us stretched tight, not hostile but full of things we hadn't yet learned how to say. I told her the baby was stable. Her shoulders fell, her eyes glistened, and she nodded with a slow, trembling motion that made something inside me loosen. She whispered that she didn't deserve to hear that news from me, but I didn't answer. It wasn't about deserving. It was about the fact that she was the only one who could understand how close we came to repeating a loss that neither of us could survive again. We didn't speak much after that. We didn't need to. The day dimmed into evening, and the sky outside turned a deep, blue-gray. The hospital lights flickered on one by one, glowing warm against the cold glass. Somewhere down the hall a nurse hummed a Christmas tune, slow and soft, almost apologetic. It was the first time in years that the sound didn't hurt me. As night settled fully, Clara shifted slightly and looked toward the window. She whispered that on the night Emily died, she had seen a star that shone brighter than the others. She said she had watched it every Christmas since, as if it were a reminder of something she couldn't name. I followed her gaze out the window and saw it too, a single star cutting through the darkness, steady and unblinking. And in a quiet place inside myself, I felt something settle, not peace but the possibility of it. Two names, I thought. Emily's and the child's. Two threads of the same broken story, tied not by tragedy but by the fragile chance of beginning again. And for the first time since the night I lost my daughter, I let myself breathe without fear. Years passed after that winter in the hospital, and Maple Harbor changed in small, careful ways. New shops opened on Main Street, old ones closed, roofs were repaired, trees grew thicker rings beneath their bark. The church bell kept ringing through the seasons, it sounded a little softer to my ears each year, not because it changed but because I did. The snow returned every December, as faithful as regret, covering the streets and the hills and the cemetery in the same white blanket that once felt like a burial and slowly became something else, something closer to a clean page. I grew older without fully noticing, the way you only realize a tree has grown when you stand next to a picture of it from years ago. My hands roughened, my hair thinned and turned grayer, my steps slowed on the way up the hill to the graveyard. But some things stayed the same. The hardware store still smelled of dust and metal and old wood. The photo of Emily still sat on the shelf above my table at home, her smile frozen in a moment that never faded. And every Christmas Eve, I still walked through the snow to the cemetery, carrying a small gift in my pocket, something simple and silly that she would have liked. The difference was that I no longer walked alone. On my right, a small hand gripped my fingers, warm inside a red mitten. On my left, another, larger hand brushed against my coat from time to time, not clinging but present, solid, offering quiet support. Ahead of us, the path wound between rows of stones, lined with the shadows of old trees, branches bare and black against the pale sky. Above them, the same star Clara had pointed out from the hospital window years before shone faintly, even before night fully settled, as if it had chosen this place and this season to burn a little brighter. The child between us skipped a little when she walked, boots crunching in the snow with a soft, regular rhythm. She had grown from a fragile, weightless presence in an incubator into a small whirlwind of questions and laughter, the kind that filled rooms and erased silences without effort. Her hair was dark like Clara's, but her eyes carried a light that reminded me of Emily's quick, curious gaze. Sometimes, when she turned her head at a certain angle or smiled too fast, my heart jumped with a familiar ache, as if two timelines had overlapped for an instant. I had learned not to run from that feeling. I had learned to let it sit beside me. We reached Emily's stone together. The years had worn the edges a little, softened the letters, but her name was still clear, still bright against the white surface. Snow lay in a thin layer on top, which I brushed away with the back of my glove, the same motion I had repeated more times than I could count. I knelt, joints protesting quietly, and placed the gift at the base of the stone. This year it was a tiny wooden ornament shaped like a star, painted by small, careful hands at the kitchen table, each brushstroke shaky but determined. I remembered how many times I had stood in this exact spot unable to feel anything but rage and emptiness. I remembered the nights when the world narrowed to the stone and the sound of my own breathing, when forgiveness felt like an insult and the idea of a future beside another child felt like betrayal. Standing there now, with the weight of a mittened hand on my shoulder and the sound of a soft sniffle behind me, I understood that grief hadn't left me. It had simply changed shape, making room for other things without disappearing. We didn't speak, standing there. The child's small frame was quiet, her head slightly bowed, as if she understood, in her own incomplete way, that this place was important in a way other places were not. Clara stood a little behind us, her coat drawn close, her hair pulled back, her face lined by years and healing. The deep, heavy guilt that once ruled her every breath had softened, not erased but no longer sharp enough to cut her from the inside. She had told the truth, lived with its consequences, and spent years trying to build something honest where lies once stood. There had been therapy sessions and long nights. There had been arguments, tears, silences that felt like cliffs. There had been moments when walking away from each other would have been easier than staying. But seasons turned, and we kept choosing to stay, not because the past wasn't heavy but because the weight was easier to carry together than apart. Her family's name had been dragged into the light, the story of that frozen road told in courtrooms and news columns, the details no longer buried under money. There were sentences and headlines, apologies and broken reputations. None of it brought Emily back. But truth, once spoken, stopped rotting in the dark. Our child grew up in the middle of that delicate, uneven landscape. She heard the story in pieces, in careful words fitted to her age, always with the same thread running through it. She was not born to erase what came before, but to live fully in spite of it. We gave her two names, one chosen by Clara, the other a quiet echo of Emily's, not a replacement but a link. Two names under the same star, two children held by the same father's hands, one on this side of life and one beyond it. I stood up slowly and stepped back, letting the child approach the stone. She bent down with clumsy grace and touched the ornament, adjusting it so it faced forward. The wind brushed her hair across her cheek, and she pushed it back with an impatient little huff that made me smile. She didn't fully understand who Emily was yet, not really. To her, Emily was both a sister she'd never meet and a story that lived in Dad's eyes every December. That was enough for now. One day she would ask harder questions. One day we would answer them. Truth wouldn't hide anymore. The light began to fade as we walked back down the hill, the sky deepening into blue, the town's Christmas lights flickering on one by one. The church bell rang in the distance, its sound no longer a knife but a reminder. Each toll felt like a step marking time, not a countdown to loss but a rhythm carrying us forward. I listened without flinching, feeling the echo in my chest like a second heartbeat. At home, the tree glowed softly in the corner of the small living room, its branches carrying simple ornaments collected over the years. Some were old and scratched, others new and bright, all of them telling pieces of a story that was no longer divided cleanly into before and after. Under the lowest branches, a single star-shaped space remained empty. The child rushed to fill it, lifting the box I had carried from the cemetery and opening it with solemn concentration. She hung a matching star on the lowest branch, right at her eye level, tongue peeking between her teeth in concentration. When she stepped back to look at it, I felt something catch quietly in my chest. 2 stars now, one carved with Emily's name, resting in the snow at the graveyard, and this one, painted by small hands, glowing under warm lights. 2 names, 2 memories, 2 lives touching without swallowing one another. Later, when the house was quiet and the child had fallen asleep on the couch under a thick blanket, the scent of pine and hot chocolate still lingering in the air, I sat in the dim light of the tree and let the weight of the years settle over me. I thought about the first time I saw Clara at the grave, the way anger and confusion twisted inside me like a storm. I thought about the contract on the table at the lodge, the confession on the frozen road, the night I almost lost them both. I thought about the baby in the incubator, fighting for each breath under blinking lights. I realized the greatest miracle I had seen wasn't the birth of a new child, or the sudden transformation of sorrow into joy. The miracle was quieter than that, slower. It was the fact that my heart, once convinced it could never open again, had learned to expand without asking my permission. It had grown around both love and pain, holding them side by side. It had made room for forgiveness without forgetting, for memory without chains, for 2 daughters held in different ways. Christmas, I understood then, was never really about the lights or the gifts or even the traditions. It was about what we choose to do with the darkness we carry. Do we hide it, cover it with money and lies, pretend it doesn't exist? Or do we dare to bring it into the open and let fragile, trembling light fall on it, even if that light shows every scar and stain? The true gift, I realized, was not the star on the tree or the name on the foundation we eventually built in Emily's honor. It was the courage to tell the truth, the decision to stay when walking away would have been easier, the choice to love a child who arrived wrapped in the echoes of tragedy, yet deserved a life built on honesty and tenderness. It was the way grief no longer sat alone at my table, but shared space with laughter, forgiveness, and small hands tugging at my sleeve. On that Christmas night, as the church bell rang again and snow fell silently outside, I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of pine and warm blankets and the faint sweetness of chocolate. I whispered both their names into the quiet, one for the child sleeping under my roof, one for the child sleeping under the snow, and felt them settle in my chest like 2 steady lights. For the first time, I did not ask why this had happened to me. I simply held the truth of it and let it be. And in that stillness, I understood that sometimes the holiest thing we can do is accept that love will always come with loss, and yet love anyway.